pretty clear there. So like Mark said, tonight I'm going to be giving you sort of an abridged version of the first two chapters of my dissertation that covered Highway 12. The remainder of my dissertation covered the construction of Dorshak Dam, and then the battle for the inclusion of the Magruder Corridor in the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness. So, without further ado, this first slide here, the image that you see is taken from the April 10th, 1954 edition of the Saturday Evening Post, an article written by Richard L. Neuberger, later congressman from Oregon, basically discussing the construction of Highway 12. So, there we go. So, on Saturday, August 8th, 1953, 9 men left from the historic Lochsa Ranger Station on a 38-mile trek of the uncompleted portion of the Lewis and Clark Highway. They sought to draw attention to the missing link of the highway, or now known as US Highway 12. They set off from the highway's endpoint at the Lochsa Ranger Station, waved goodbye to a bulldozer, and headed down the trail. The trail ended quickly, and the group bushwhacked and scrambled along the north shore of the Lochsa River. One member of the group recounted that there was no physical evidence that man had ever traveled this route before. So, the trek participants included 9 local men from throughout north central Idaho, ranging in age from 18 to 70 years old, each carrying a 40-pound pack. There they are with their lovely packs. The group's oldest member, Henry Lyons of Kamiah, known as a veteran hunter and mountain man, and another group member, L.W. Randall, later concluded that Lyons was the only man in the group who knew what we were headed for, but he said little about it when we started. So, the group described themselves as physically soft and unaccustomed to this kind of hiking over the roughest possible terrain, and took 5-minute rest periods every half hour. On the second day of the trip, the group's youngest member, Wayne Snyder, took sick. Group members suspected appendicitis. The group continued on anyway, and on the third day reached Post Office Creek and picked up a forest service trail indicating that there were 18 more miles until their finish at the Powell Ranger Station. On the fourth day, the group reached Jerry Johnson Ranger Station, and they phoned the Powell Ranger Station and discovered that the Forest Service had dispatched 3 airplanes to look for them. They were running 2 days late at that point. So later that day, the group finally made it to Powell, and in total they walked 55 miles in 53.5 hours. Trek participant Harold Coe of Clarkston said at the 1962 completion ceremony of the highway, "It was a much tougher trek than any of us had anticipated, and a longer one. But we believe our walk revived interest in the early completion of the Lewis and Clark Highway. The customary delays followed through congressional hearings and red tape, but now, 9 years later, the highway is a finished reality." So there's part of the missing link. No road. Well, there's a tiny road cut through there at that point, but really not too much going on in those parts yet. So, in my talk tonight, I'm going to cover basically the 40-plus years that it took to finish Highway 12 through north central Idaho. I'm going to talk about funding issues, where funding came from to build the highway, the interest groups that promoted the highway that included local chambers of commerce, clubs like the Brink and a Half Club. The Brink and a Half Club was individuals that had basically put their cars into the Clearwater River, and they decided to make a club out of it, which later became a travel promotion club for north central Idaho. But they wanted to reward themselves with a certain distinction. But anyway, these groups that were interested, they were interested in promoting the road as a military or civilian defense road. They promoted the road as access to natural resources, timber, mining, and also as a path for tourists to get through this part of the world. Also, this road served to link up the entire Pacific Northwest to local, state, global markets, and eventually link to the Snake River dams. And I'll finish up with a quick touch on contemporary issues, opening up this remote space to resource extraction, what that did, tourism, and how basically Highway 12 is a globally significant highway today for a variety of reasons. So we see here, Highway 12. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It is one of my favorite drives in the United States. Mark said I'm from Wisconsin. The first time I came out west was in 2006. I was in Montana for a day, and they sent me over to Lewiston then to work at the Lewis and Clark bicentennial events, and I had to drive on Highway 12. And it was pouring rain, but there was fog coming up out of the trees along the lock saw, and it sealed the deal. I was coming back here. So before Highway 12, there was the Lolo Trail. Lolo Trail is still there today. The earliest users of Lolo Trail were the Nez Perce, and it was the Buffalo Trail, going to Buffalo country. The Nez Perce would go over this trail to get to Buffalo on the plains, and Salish tribes would come westward over the trail to get to fishing. So those are some of the earliest users of the trail. Then, of course, in 1805 to 1806, Lewis and Clark expedition. They go over the trail at the wrong time of year. We all know how that ends. They meet the Nez Perce, and lucky for them, they did. Then in 1858, there's the Mullen Survey. Mullen basically came through this part of the world looking for easy ways to get over the Bitterroots. He tried coming through north central Idaho, and after his attempt at doing that, he described it as one immense bed of rugged, difficult, pine-clad mountains that can never be converted to any purpose for the use of man. Positive. Then, in 1865, the Byrd-Truax expedition came through the Lolo Trail. Basically what happened then is Congress had allocated $50,000 for construction of a trail from Virginia City, Montana, the gold camps there, over to Lewiston, which was a central supply point for the region at that time. That $50,000 was quickly spent, and all that was really accomplished on that mission was a really roughly bushwhacked trail. It really didn't do too much. Then in 1900, railroads attempted to come through the region. The Clearwater Short Line Railroad Company did a survey of the Lolo Trail, as well as the Union Pacific. They decided it really wasn't feasible to build rail line through there. And then later, the Union Pacific and the Northern Pacific, bitter rivals, decided that they would try and bring something over Lolo Pass and over the Bitterroots. That didn't work either. So that takes us up to 1916. In 1916, state of Idaho designated this route here as Idaho State Route 9, or Forest Route 16. Once that was designated, they would like a road there. The road didn't happen, obviously, for quite a while until 1962. But since it was designated a forest road, it got that designation because it was still running through Forest Service land at that time. At that time, that was the Bitterroot Forest Reserve, which encompassed pretty much all of north central Idaho to about here, and most parts of western Montana, one giant chunk of Forest Service land, and eventually that was divvied up into the Clearwater National Forest and St. Joe's and all the national forests that we kind of are familiar with today. So, in 1916, Major Fenn, who is right here in the picture, one of the older gentlemen, Major Fenn, Frank Fenn, was the first supervisor of the Bitterroot Forest Reserve, and he was able to secure $300,000 from Congress in order to build on what was designated as Idaho State Road 9 or Forest Road 16. He gets that $300,000 because he wants access to the ranger stations in there, and they want access to the timber stands available. There's an estimated, 1.5 billion board feet of timber that timber cruisers figured were in the region, and they wanted access to that, hence the need for a road. So, Fenn kind of goes on a whistle-stop tour of Missoula, Lewiston, begins pushing for the road. So that's really the beginnings of pushing for roads through the Bitterroot. Road construction began finally in 1918. somewhere between 1916 and 1918, the budget went from $300,000 to $235,000. And the state of Idaho kicked in $58,000, and 22 miles of road were completed between Kuski and Lowell. Interestingly, though, right about this time is when the federal government is really getting into the business of hydroelectric power production. In 1920, with the Federal Power Act, the federal government set aside half-mile swaths of land on each side of the Clearwater, the Lochsaw, or the middle fork of the Clearwater, the Lochsaw, and the Selway for hydroelectric power development. So they've got claim to that land for potential dams later. Then in 1933, the state of Idaho had requested for right-of-way to build highway through there, and eventually the state got it. This is an excerpt from the report of the Federal Power Commission from 1933, which basically says, yes, you can build roads through here. If any agency wants to build a dam at any point in time, they will be responsible for relocating the highway and the cost of relocating the highway. Okay, so 1920s roll through, the Depression takes place. Nobody has money for road building, so things are kind of on hold. There are little efforts here and there. The Works Progress Association, a notable Depression-era program, worked somewhat on the highway. There were men that were bused from Lewiston out to various stretches of the highway to work on the road at that time, but really there wasn't any major concerted effort to work on the road at that point. But in 1921, the Lewis and Clark Highway Association had formed, and they were formed to advocate for the highway as a feeder to a developed system of waterways, a transcontinental highway, a military road, and a commercial route between western states, and as a means of opening an area of great recreational value and providing access to Yellowstone Park. Notably, Highway 12 runs all the way from Detroit to the west coast of the United States. So if that road could be completed through the Bitterroots, people from this part of the world would have an easier time getting over to Yellowstone, theoretically. So, like I said before, multiple interest groups, like the Lewis and Clark Highway Association, got behind building the highway. Mining, access to timber stands, recreation are all foremost in their heads for reasons of being able to access this area. The Lewiston Morning Tribune claimed that the highway would, quote unquote, establish a new relationship between the interior and the coast. It's a pretty bold statement. So, the only problem though at this time is that Idaho is also working on completing Highway 95, the north-south route through Idaho, and the state placed more value on that route than they did on Highway 12. So any state funds that would have been contributed to Highway 12 ended up going to 95 instead. So, then in 1940, Marcus Means, a man from Lewiston, decided that he would pay his own way to go to Washington, D.C. and lobby Congress and what we now know as the Department of Defense. What was it called then, Mark?
The War Department.
Yeah, the War Department. Lobbied the War Department to classify Highway 12 as a first priority military road, or a way just to move people and to move military equipment throughout north central Idaho. He went to DC, and his pleas to have the highway designated as a military road, they worked, but they didn't get him any money. So, or they didn't get the highway any money. Then finally, basically what happened, there were small pots of money allocated between 1940 and 1950, $25,000, $50,000, $80,000 here and there, but really nothing that could push the highway's construction all the way across the state of Idaho. Then in 1950, Len Jordan was elected governor of Idaho, and he campaigned on fiscal restraint and removed all state funding for highways and refused all federal funding as well. So during Len Jordan's term as governor of Idaho, highways didn't go anywhere. But Here's a lovely example of road ruts. This is early 1950s, judging by the vehicle there. But that was the state of the highway at the time. So don't complain today. During the 1940s and 50s, like I said before, various labor pools were utilized in construction of the highway. Dr. Weggers from University of Idaho, she writes about the Akuski internment camp. That was one source of labor for the highway construction. And these are some of the pictures there. You can kind of pick it out. There's a man here that is rappelling down that rock face. And this is in the Black Canyon stretch of the highway, one of the narrowest stretches of Highway 12. Lots of dynamite blasting. Notably, the Japanese internees and the one Italian and the few Germans that were there really didn't have any road construction experience and were planting dynamite charges themselves and rappelling off of rocks and doing some pretty harrowing work given their experience. Also, some construction pictures there. This picture here is, you can kind of make it out, canvas tents right along the shore of the Laksa, the construction administration, headquarters for the highways. Construction workers just walking through Black Canyon. This is August of 1951. And at that point in 1951, 25 miles of the road remained to be completed. Theoretically a small distance, but given what the geology and the river system presents in that part of the world, it's pretty difficult to get through. More pictures of construction. The caption there says, a workman tamps powder into a deeply drilled hole in a canyon wall at a road widening project a short distance east of Lowell. This picture was taken in 1958. This is really interesting. The Women of Woodman was a group of women out of Woodman, Montana, who would come up over Lolo Pass, because Montana had completed the road up to Lolo Pass. Idaho hadn't done its job on the other side. But the Women of Woodman would come up there during the summer with their kids and fill potholes. The Women of Woodman made a proclamation that if they had anything to say about it, the potholes would be filled. And they did it. There we go. So, money was difficult to come by. There were various federal pots of money that were available, which sometimes were utilized, sometimes were not. But since there were any number of people clamoring for the highway to get done, people from Lewiston thought that there would be a better way to go about it, namely making the Lewis and Clark Highway a toll road. And so they formed the Lewis and Clark Turnpike Association in 1955. They published this great brochure entitled Wake Up, Rip. See this man, he kind of looks like the shape of Idaho too, sleeping there. But they printed that brochure and they did a sale of bumper stickers. And the sale of the bumper stickers was made to finance a feasibility study to see whether Highway 12 could be a toll road. They hired a contractor out of Cincinnati, and the contractor decided that, yes, Highway 12 could be a toll road. And then after they got the Turnpike Association's money, they also spoke to somebody at the U.S. Bureau of Roads, and the U.S. Bureau of Roads said, well, yeah, you can have a toll road, but then the federal government won't give you any more money to finish the road. So, one or the other. So, there we go. So this interesting map, this was part of the Wake Up Rip flyer. It shows the various fits and starts of construction. And it shows nice abbreviations here, who funded what, when. You can see in these little fits and starts, 3/4 of a mile here, graded and drained by Forest Service money. 3.2 miles graded and surfaced in 1954. That's basically the story of the highway. It was completed in little fits and starts with various little pots of money. So it took a while.
Wow.
Then in 1957, height of the Cold War, there was something that went on from 1954 until 1961. Basically, they were national civil defense alerts that happened on one day. There was one day nationally, and in the morning, there would be a simulated air raid that would happen across the United States. And municipalities would be telegraphed, or Western Union telegram would be sent to them explaining their part of the disaster simulation. So in this part of the world, Mountain Home Air Force Base was bombed, Hanford was obliterated, hydroelectric power production sites in the southern part of Idaho were completely blasted. And so in this scenario, thousands of people were headed north up Highway 95 to get out of the southern part of the state and coming over from the Hanford area to get out of the radiation that was theoretically seeping at them. And so they were all coming into the Lewiston area. And so these simulated bombs that hit all over, once this exercise was done, and it should be noted the first day of the exercise involved everybody. After that, these articles give pretty interesting description of what happened at the federal level. Eisenhower went into a bunker, and then he went out of the bunker to go golfing, and then then he got back into the bunker to continue the disaster simulation, and then he got out of the bunker to go to a family birthday party, and so these disaster simulations would happen annually for quite a while. But so the disaster